By your perseverance, you will secure your lives. As we approach the end of ordinary time, as we approach the end of the liturgical year, our readings take on an apocalyptic dimension. They speak about how one should live in the light of the end of time. At the risk of making us uncomfortable, Jesus wants to shake his disciples, that is us, out of our complacency. Even if we are not particularly inclined to focus on the end of the world, we would do well to at least acknowledge our own mortality. And St. Ignatius of Loyola, in his spiritual exercises, encouraged retreatants to contemplate their death as a way to gain greater clarity about how they should live their lives. When we don't take our life for granted, we are more likely to live with a greater sense of purpose and a better understanding of our priorities. In our readings today, while the prophet Malachi reminds us that the ultimate triumph will belong to God, Jesus reminds us that there will be trials and tribulations in every age. These troubles can take many forms: wars that seem far away, or violence closer to home, natural disasters, the lack of respect for the sanctity of life, the plight of those who are homeless or fleeing oppression or caught up in human trafficking, the anxiety that can accompany growing older, or the fears that we have for our children and grandchildren and the world they will inherit. While these tribulations come to us without ceasing, especially if we become glued to the 24/7 news cycle, most of us at some point in our lives struggle with trials of a more personal nature. For those who are weighed down by grief or depression, for those who battle entrenched addictions, for those who are unable to find lasting and meaningful employment, for those who struggle with a debilitating illness, for those whose faith and hope are stretched to the limit, the challenge to simply hang on is fought minute by minute. Regardless of whether trouble seems distant or all too immediate, Jesus tells us, by your perseverance, you will secure your lives. As we come to the end of ordinary time, we find ourselves in something of a parallel to our journey during Lent and Easter. During Lent, we focus on the qualities of Jesus and how he ultimately deals with rejection and failure. During the Easter season, we focus on how God can transform even failure and death into faith and new life. During ordinary time, we continue to journey with Jesus, but the subtext is our willingness, or lack thereof, to align ourselves with Jesus and to truly live out our Easter faith. It is this Easter faith that we need to call to mind, especially when we are beset by trials and tribulations. Each day, but especially when anxiety and fear are knocking at the door, we need to really consider if Jesus will remain the focus of our life. In short, we must ask ourselves if we will accept the challenge of Jesus to persevere. Each of our readings offers us helpful advice in our struggle to persevere. The prophet Malachi reminds us that we need to be ever mindful of the Lord. Daily prayer can be a powerful antidote to trials and tribulations and negativity. Those who put God first in their lives will experience God's healing power and protection. St. Paul tells the Thessalonians and us that we need to work quietly and to eat our own food. Paul meant this both literally and metaphorically. Some of the Thessalonians were so certain that the end of the world was just around the corner that they had quit their jobs and were living on the generosity of others. Aside from this plain admonition to get back to work, Paul is urging us to look at our own faults before minding the business of others. He is inviting us to imitate the saints, both in the trust they placed in God and in the way they lived their lives. Finally, Jesus reminds us of the need to follow his path. We need to recognize that the temptation to stray from Jesus can come from both sides, from feeling so secure in our own accomplishments that we see little need for God in our lives and thus abandon our faith, or the other extreme of being so beset by trials and tribulations that we come to the belief that God has abandoned us. But Jesus reminds us that he is with us always, that he will give us wisdom, that he will give us the words we need when we are attacked, and that he will protect every hair on our head. Our faith tells us that Jesus persevered to the end, even when beset by trials and tribulations. Jesus encourages us to follow his example. I think it is worth noting that persevering does not necessarily mean working harder or doing more with less. And it certainly doesn't mean following a plan that leads to desolation rather than consolation. It does mean continually discerning how God is leading us to refine our priorities and to live with greater purpose. A couple of Sundays ago, I mentioned the apostolic planning process in which the Jesuits' USA East Province is engaged, and which is centered around the universal apostolic preferences of the Society of Jesus. With apologies to those who have already committed them to memory, they are to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and the practice of discernment, to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, and those whose dignity has been violated, in a mission of reconciliation and justice, to journey together with young people, to build a hope-filled future, and to work together to care for the earth, our common home. While these preferences reflect our continuing desire to serve God's greater glory, AMDG for those who are steeped in Jesuit speak, they also help us to reaffirm our purpose and priorities while considering our changed circumstances, such as having fewer Jesuits to spread around. In other words, they are the fruit of our ongoing discernment of how we hope to persevere. Perseverance can mean choosing to focus on some things that one can do well, rather than being spread so thin that one accomplishes nothing. Perseverance can mean acknowledging that the path forward requires walking side by side with others, rather than thinking that one can accomplish something alone. Perseverance always means recognizing that the end result is in the hands of God, which frees us to walk humbly with Jesus and one another. I am confident that many of you have already figured out these lessons and how to apply them in your lives. The universal apostolic preferences are the Jesuits' way of acknowledging that we can't and shouldn't try to do everything, but that by working together with you, we may be able to do some things quite well, especially if we allow God to guide us. By your perseverance, you will secure your lives. Let us pray that we will all persevere by following Jesus.